So now we're going to move on to our next session, and Michael Huijser needs no introduction. He has an eminent and really distinguished career in arts and cultural heritage in the Netherlands and is now the CEO of Het Scheepvaartmuseum, this wonderful institution, which has welcomed us today. Michael is really going to look at the whole question of social relevance in museums, contributions and the exhibitions that we present, but not just from the point of view of being more socially relevant, but also interrogating some of the complexities that are involved in this. So after Michael's presentation, he's going to be joined on the stage with a panel of kind of eminent speakers. So I'm going to welcome Michael now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Actually, I was thinking of making my talk about the Wake Museum. How you get from woke to wake. Maybe that's an interesting topic as well. Ladies and gentlemen, maritime friends. Over the last 15 years, we have learned to judge the quality of our museums in economic terms. Our criteria for success are and were attendance figures and income goals. And today, museums have come to resemble commercial enterprises. And over the years, the numbers, for example, for Dutch museums, has risen from 22 million to 34 million visitors a year. So you might say that economic model has been a success. Yet, this model had already begun to wear thin before Corona. Museums has found themselves caught in a spiraling demand for blockbusters exhibitions, which were increasingly expensive to put on and which needed huge audience to break even. For some museums, this had become a problem and it was leading to growing backlash. When they focus on increasing attendance figures and income, and on covering costs, museums had less opportunity to do research, to improve quality, and to curate collections, let alone to experiment, and, very important here as well, to build new networks. In the meantime, today's social and political turmoil has arrived in our museum doorsteps, and we found ourselves inadvertently with some new opportunities. After all, we, museums, are the keepers of nations' history, culture and art, and objects that bear silent witness to the passage of time provide a context with which we had a conversation this morning to re-examine the world around us. And my story today is about the alternative approaches available to maritime museums to address contemporary issues, enabling us to play a more meaningful role in our current society. In 2022, the National Maritime Museum launched the exhibition Humans at Sea, a wide-ranging exhibition featuring an array of personal stories about the sea and seafaring. Mariners, passengers, lone voyagers across the ocean, they all are trying to get from A to B, traveling between different worlds and sailing beyond the familiar. A life on water is all about freedom and transition, yet also about social structures and hierarchy on board ships. And Humans at Sea show how being out on the oceans forces a person to come to terms with themselves, with others, with the ship and the water, which brings even bigger themes into play such as gender, inclusivity and migration. Humans at Sea came exactly at the right time for the National Maritime Museum, and soon we began adding new stories. For example, we commissioned a photographer of women at the Navy. But another story, one of the new story, was Queer at Sea. Queers working on the ocean liners developed a distinct subculture. The tolerant attitudes of the shipping companies, of shipmates and crew gave the subculture and an opportunity to flourish. Queer on board of the SS Rotterdam, and you've seen the ship in Rotterdam, and ashore a harbor city such as New York, found a refuge from conservative predictions and expectations of conventional Dutch societies. These were the places where they could be themselves. And listen to the stories that Toon, Henk and Meijner tell, and meet Gilles and Charles, who recall their time on the SS Rotterdam.
Zeilen voor een heleboel mensen die op schepen gevaren hebben, schepen zoals dit, is een escape van de werkelijkheid. Ik kon niet goed opschieten met paboe of met mijn familie. En als ik kan werken op zo'n schip met nog meer gays, dan kan ik mezelf zijn. Je komt aan boord en dan word je vanzelf door andere gays ontdekt. Ja, want je bent een beetje schuw. Ja. En dan komt er ineens dan maar iemand naar me toe. Nou, kom maar meid, jij hebt toch ook van de familie? Weet je wel, zoiets. Ja, ja dan is het ijs gebroken.
Ja, er werden veel parties gehouden hoor. Onderling dan in de hutten.
Het was altijd feest. Je had een hut met 4 kooien. Maar als jij een keer een avond vroeg naar bed zou willen, gewoon omdat je moe was, dat kon eigenlijk niet. Want er waren nog 3 anderen die wel een borreltje wilden drinken.
Ik heb 14 jaar in zijn totaliteit gevaren. Maar met zoveel plezier. Ik had soms als ik dan met vakantie thuis was, had ik weer heimwee om naar die boot te gaan.
Ja, je miste je gay familie.
Ja, precies. Ja.
Another sub-project in our permanent exhibition Amsterdam Port City looks at so-called guest workers, people from various Mediterranean countries who came to work in Amsterdam docks between 1960 and 1980 and who settled here with their families. What was it like for these people to move to a new country and build a new life? And their story is also now in the exhibition Amsterdam Port City. Working with the interviewer Ahmet Batman, the Maritime Museum has collected the story of the guest workers from Turkey who made Amsterdam their home.
Dedeler bülbülü altın kafese koymuşlar. Ah vatan, vah vatan demiş.
Hi, ik ben Ahmet Batman en neem jullie graag mee op een bijzondere reis door de geschiedenis van de Amsterdamse haven. De naoorlogse jaren brachten een periode van wederopbouw met zich mee, waarin Nederlandse bedrijven, waaronder de NDSM en ADM, op zoek waren naar extra arbeidskrachten. Om aan deze vraag te voldoen werden er overeenkomsten gesloten met landen zoals Marokko, Turkije, Italië, Joegoslavië en Spanje. Dit opende de deuren voor duizenden mensen die hun thuisland verlieten op zoek naar werk en een betere toekomst.
Nasıl kendi vatandaşlarım Türkiye'deki kardeşlerimse Hollanda'daki insanlar da kardeşlerim.
Het project Baklava in Amsterdam Havenstad is een verdiepende laag van mijn project Tussen Tompoes en Baklava, waarvoor ik door heel Europa verhalen van de eerste generatie Turkse gastarbeiders aan het ophalen ben. Het doel is om de geschiedenis van de eerste generatie gastarbeiders in de Amsterdamse haven te documenteren, als cultureel erfgoed te bewaren en te delen. Voel jij je verbonden tot deze verhalen en zou je daar meer over willen horen of dit willen delen met je opa, oma, vader, moeder of wie dan ook uit je leven? Hou dan de social media kanalen van het Scheepvaartmuseum in de gaten of kijk op hetscheepvaartmuseum.nl.
Keşkeleriniz var mı?
Çok. Hiçbirisini anlatmayayım.
Shadows Over the Atlantic World is our latest presentation, which opens next week, but you will have a preview this afternoon. And this preview, we invite you to see that we go a step further. Shadows Over the Atlantic World is about the impact colonization has had on people's life, on the sea and on its land, on its history, on its legacy. We have invited contributors to comment on our collection in contemporary art and videos, presenting personal stories, putting our collection in a different, previously untold perspective. These are just 3 examples These are just 3 examples. This is also shadows on the Atlantic world. These are just 3 examples of ways in which we are expanding the National Maritime Museum collection by incorporating new socially relevant stories. So what are our ground rules for adding new stories to the collection or to an exhibition, for showing the collection also in a different context? And we have identified 4 basic premises. One of them is an honest museum embraces doubt and dares to ask questions. And that sounds maybe a little bit simple, but when engagement, for example, leads to activism, a museum has to be aware of losing its sense of direction and balance. Activism is about taking a stand, and that can alienate sections of the museum audience. It may also turn the museum into an exclusive club. After all, it's not a museum job to proclaim a truth. A museum job is to search for honesty, and honesty can be elusive. Activism can easily obscure it. And honesty is about being true to yourself. It's about recognizing potential blind spots on the road to diversity. It's about recognizing the courage to give outsiders the key of the museum. And honesty is also about stepping outside the museum's parameters. It's something museums must continually recalibrate and discuss. For example, we recently commissioned an indigenous artist who works with natural material, which goes against our own museum guidelines. And as a consequence, instead of enthusiasm, she found herself facing a stew of museum restrictions. Second, an honest museum is part of the social fabric and has its own agenda. A museum is constantly asking itself whether its narrative relates to the visitor experience. That's why we have to listen to our audience and to ask questions, of course. And what we found out that our current exhibition, Food for Thought, that is a really good example of an exhibition which is really on an issue, focused on an issue where people are dealing with. It's an exhibition, it encourages people to think about the food they consume. So it's very close by. To be aware, for instance, that the food on your plate has traveled an average of 30,000 kilometers. And especially this exhibition attracts a very young audience, between 20 and 30 years old, completely different than other exhibitions. An honest museum is trustworthy, and it's very important, and displays genuine objects. Although a museum has to be prudent when getting involved in social issues, it remains a place where genuine objects are displayed. The importance of this cannot be overstated. The importance that you have the genuine objects to tell stories. And museums use the past to explain the present and discuss the future. And genuine objects aren't there to represent an immutable reality. The purpose is to position contemporary Earth issues in the proper context. So museums are not alone about the objects. The objects are there to tell the stories about people, and the objects are about authenticity and reality. And sometimes, if there are no objects to show, a museum should commission people, or commission photographers or artists to add new stories. That's how we write tomorrow's history, as we have seen in some examples in my presentation. Or, maybe as an example, we bought a couple of years ago these 2 pieces by the Indonesian artist Ade Darmawan. And we saw it on an art fair, and it looks like a cartography of our collection, and it is cartography of our collection. But if you pass by these 2 images, suddenly the Dutch ships are disappearing. So now we put this on display close to our cartography exhibitions. 4, an honest museum has space for symbolic and emotional value. When we started to refurbish our replica VOC ship here in Amsterdam, we discovered that visitors were leaving the ship with more questions when they came aboard. Because we had focusing on the details, what would happen on Dutch vessels like this. We had missed out on more general subjects like slavery or piracy. So we added also two new themes to our presentation. We made the ship actually a symbol. And on the other hand, a symbol of trade, but on the other hand, a symbol of oppression. And now we also tell a third story. Why in the Dutch history we built in the Netherlands in 1985 such a ship? What was the world like then? Why in the middle of an economic slump were people building replicas like this? It's an excellent example of the way an existing object can give rise to new stories. Finally, not every subject that matters today will be relevant tomorrow. It may never become part of an historical narrative. That's why it's all the more important to be aware of this and to talk with each other about it and quiz each other about it, as we are doing here today, tomorrow, and the last days during this ICMM Congress. Thank you very much, and I will end by our brand movie, which reflects the situation we are in at the moment.
Alles komt boven water. Het mooie, het heftige, het mysterieuze. Ons verleden dat doorwerkt in het nu. Van schaamte tot trots. En echte zeehelden. Alles komt boven water in het Scheepvaartmuseum. Tijd om het met eigen ogen te komen bekijken. En met andere ogen naar buiten te gaan.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Can I just ask some people now to join Michael on the stage? So Paddy Rodgers from Royal Museums Greenwich and Hoege from Mariners, Hanna Hagmark from Åland, Lars, Lars Amréus, and also Andreia Conceição from Sesimbra.
There.
Okay. On this very crowded stage.
Yes, very crowded.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to, this panel is really going to interrogate some of the issues that Michael raised. Can you see Michael behind me here? Then the first question that we're putting to the panel is this one. Michael makes a distinction between museums being socially relevant and being socially activist. And in fact, I just want to quote what he said because I think it's really important. When engagement leads to activism, a museum has to be aware of losing its sense of direction and balance. And I say to the panel, what do you think? Are there limits on how we present issues of social relevance in museums? Who would like to start? Lars.
Well, thank you. I think it all comes down to the definition of the word activism. Mm-hmm. If I ask you all to think of an activist, imagine the face. I know who you're thinking of. Right? It's Greta Thunberg, right? So that's one part of activism. Another part of activism could be, you said it yourself, Michael, is to take a stand, to choose a side. And I think we do that all the time, actually, in museums. We take a stand on climate issues, we take a stand on different social issues, on gender rights, on LGBTQ rights, and we should. But the question is how we do it. So I think that it's sort of what it boils down to. Mm-hmm. I think we're all activists, but and we should be, because we're agents for a better society. But how do we do it in a way that is inclusive and that maintains the trust of our institutions?
Yeah, and Lars, thank you, because I think you've raised a couple of important issues. One is that our language has to be more specific than it is. What do we actually mean by activism? And Paddy, you want to comment on the next thing?
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, we've had two really great speeches this morning. Keynote speakers, absolutely dramatically good. And Michael's obviously given a lot of thought to the issue. But there's a link here with Lars's choice of Greta, because Greta Thunberg didn't make a statement or a projection. She asked a question. What's the point of the education you're going to give me if it got you where you are? Mm-hmm. And she went on school strike. I think that framing of a big question goes right to the heart of what the first speaker was saying around you're already starting from a poorly framed conversation. You walked into the middle of a conversation which is dominated by a voice and a way of thinking. And what you have to do is to doubt, challenge, be rational, a scientific method, and saying, what are we doing here? What's our purpose? I think one of the great words that we can think of for what our purpose is to build the muscle in human beings of empathy for another human being's position.
Hanna.
Yes, I'm agreeing with you that we, first of all, had two really, really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. And to some extent, perhaps, if the thought of activism, if we are activists in the right kind of ways, asking the right questions, that is when we become socially relevant. That is how we become relevant, not necessarily taking a very firm stand on a particular issue, which is perhaps what you were indicating with activism, where you become almost militant, because that might alienate others. But this being activists in a way that makes us socially relevant, being brave to ask the questions and listening to the answers, like you said also about this daring to be honest.
I will share about activisms in museums. I will share an experience of the work of the work that Sesimbra Maritime Museum has been done since the last 5 years. We tried to be activists without taking a particular position, but being the trigger for people to talk. In Portugal, we had a dictatorship for almost 50 years, and we not celebrate, but we talk about this because 2024 is the 50th anniversary of our dictatorship, of the end of the dictatorship. So people in our hometown, in my hometown, sometimes they have problems to talk about this, especially the women. And sometimes when we do interviews at the museum, people start talking. Oh, in that time, society was so much better because people were more respectful and so. And we start interviewing the women from our communities that actually leave the dictatorship alone in a safe place at the museum, in a very informal context, and they start talking about hungry stories about domestic violence, about rape, and we were quite not shocked but surprised, and we asked the permission for that ladies to use that stories in an artistical performance collective with actors from the community and professional actors. And at some point we asked for the permission to show their faces in a big screen in the middle of the streets, and they allow us to show the stories, and they could tell the stories in the first voice. So I think we can be can be activists by being the trigger and the floor for people to talk about those painful stories as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Howard, do you want to make a comment on this?
Thank you. I actually very much agree with Mikhail that that we run the risk of losing our way when we try to start defining the meaning of these specific words. The things, and I don't pretend to speak for the entire museum field. I'm not sophisticated enough to develop a philosophy on this for all, but with respect to our institution, we have very clearly defined a mission, and we say that mission is to connect people to the world's waters, because through the waters, through our shared maritime heritage, we are connected to one another. A shared maritime heritage is not a common maritime heritage, it is a shared one. And you spoke so eloquently about value and the way that you value people. I'd like to just tell two very quick stories about ways that we've tried to approach this through our museum to be consistent with our collection. The first is that when we reposition ourselves as a community resource in service of our community and define this mission, we were still charging $14 US a person to enter. So a family of 5 would spend $70 to come to the Mariners Museum, presumably to hear what we would tell them. And we'd had to eliminate that intellectual disconnect for some that can't afford that financial barrier to our museum. So we lowered our price of admission to $1 per person. And I'll never forget engaging with a man who is an African-American shipyard worker or shipbuilder in Newport News Shipbuilding in our community. And he was coming out of a gallery in which we have a cutaway of cutaway of a submarine and a ready room of an aircraft carrier. And he was pushing a stroller with a boy who's presumably his grandson. And as we were coming out, I thanked them and for being there. And he, after a short conversation, stopped me and asked, he said, "You know, I'm a retired shipyard worker." And I said, "I did not know that. You might know that Newport News Shipbuilding founded the Mariners Museum." He said, "I did know that. We have not had the opportunity to come here much." He said, "But how many people do you think can say worked on a nuclear aircraft carrier and a nuclear sub?" And I don't know what he was doing in that gallery, but I presumed that he had gone in there to tell his story to his grandson, and we tried to facilitate that.
Yeah. In some ways, it really sounds that it's perhaps less about relevance or activism. Maybe I keep forgetting that I've actually got this, so you can hear me anyway. And it's more about reimagining the museum based on principles of social justice, which is really just recognizing the fact that we're all in this pond together, and we all need to recognize one another. The word humanity has come out here a number of times. Does anybody want to comment on that? Michael, do you want to?
I think museums are like libraries are very trustworthy places, and that's the balance. I think people trust us. People come to you with the stories, very personal stories. So we have to embrace that and to recognize that we have. So if you're a trustworthy institute, the best way of our exhibition, Food for Thought, is literally an exhibition about food for thought, to think about our food system. Maybe if you see it, you can call it an activist exhibition. But the only thing we do on that exhibition is giving facts and figures. We don't say you have to be vegetarian or you don't have, but we show it, that we are living in an unhealthy world about the food system. But we don't judge. People can judge themselves.
Lars, did you have a comment? And I wanted to get on to the next question after that.
Yeah, well, I think I do actually. The concept of trustworthy is at the core here somewhere, and I, for one, don't like being told what to think, and that is sort of a key thing. I've seen some exhibitions in Sweden, very,
didactic?
Well, made with all the good intentions. Let's make a project on democracy. Let's, because we see we have a need to do this. And to me, those kind of projects never really fly, basically, because they don't touch those strings, and they sort of tell me what to think rather than ask me the right questions.
Thank you. And I think that really sort of the issue of trust is extremely important here. And the next question I wanted to ask was the role of the public in this whole issue of social relevance and how far can we go. And I think, what latitude do you think the public will give us in terms of being socially relevant? Where are the boundaries of that trust? And I think your comment was really very interesting about your example about how the public very much trusted you to tell very, very personal stories in a very, very public space.
I wonder if we're prepared to be really radical, because maybe the trust could be built if we trusted the public. Because I think one of the things that we're going to see a change to, and I think we can all feel it coming, is understanding that the creative moment for our work happens in the gallery every day. and that the process of somebody interacting with what's been shown to them is a creative process. And if we can activate that moment so that there is more engagement at this point, so that it's about a dialogue with people, so that they can understand why this matters to them, and we begin to get the tools to do it. This is the creative moment, not editing labels, selecting the items from the collection. It's actually bringing it all together in a forum, in a room in which people can talk. And we've had some recent success trying to use that as the creative process, where you might have a committee or a group of people who represent a community, who could represent a different perspective, to look at a problem with you and then start to create that dialogue. But we don't have the answers, and we mustn't think the creativity sits entirely in our hands.
If we don't have the answers, how do we engage with the public to make them part of the production process? How do we do that? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think when you work in the smaller museum, it's easier because it's a smaller community. One thing that we've been reflecting in the last years is what is public and what is community. Is the person who visits the museum once part of the community of the museum, or is just public, or is just a visitor? What we have done, we open calls, public calls, and ask people to come to the museum to meet with us and to, in a very collaborative process, to program, to give suggestions, not only about papers or online forms, but to talk to us. What topics do you want that the museum talk about, and we can all talk together. I think when we involve people at the process of creation, it's easier because they are not the audience or the public. They are active part of the process.
Thank you.
And but as I told, in smaller museums, in smaller communities, it's easier.
Hanna, do you want to comment? You have direct experience.
Yes, so I agree completely. We are different kinds of museums, and as such, we have different fora and opportunities. And being a fairly, in world terms, perhaps a small museum, but in your community, a big player, you have a lot of mandate and a lot of opportunity, but you also need to take that opportunity and be activist in the sort of way that you reach out to the community, like you do, like we do at the museum. And that is, we perhaps have an easier way of reaching out deep into our fairly small communities, but it is also their stories we tell. And I think it's really interesting what you said about the difference between the community and the visitor and so on. So we obviously have a lot of tourists, and for us they are visitors. But we really want to be like a world-class museum, but with a strong local connection. So it is the local story that we want to tell, and we are also often in dialogue with our visitors, or our community, where we talk about issues that are important for them, particularly when we start looking at new exhibitions or developments and so on.
Thank you. Howard.
Thank you. So the concept of servant leadership says basically two things. The first is that an organization's posture within the community is in service of something bigger than themselves, right? And that's the health of the community. And that job one as a servant leader is to empower and develop people. And so one of the things that we've worked on at our museum is we've actually tried to very deliberately stop using the word audience. Because audience, and the fact that we tell stories to an audience assumes that the knowledge lies with us, that we are somewhat performative, and your job as an audience is just to receive what we have to give you. And so in the wake of George Floyd, I would tell you that one of the things that we did is we started with our own collection, and we had these incredible images of shipyard workers, black men, literally pouring the foundation of our institution. And we recognized as an institution, we didn't know the names of any of these men. And so we went out to our community to crowdsource the names of these men. And today we've identified every single person that's in our images. And it was covered by the local media. And we were very open and honest about the fact that we didn't know who these people were. And we have now accounts of the descendants of some of the the people that literally poured the foundation of our institution, who said, I knew my grandfather's name. I had no idea what my grandfather did. And now we're the keepers of that history, you know, serving the community.
Thank you, Howard. I think we're going to have to end there because I've already sort of gone into a lot of your time over coffee. But I think I would leave you with that issue about the necessity of being in constant dialogue with our public, because I think that issue of trust, which Lars raised, is really one that's very important. And there's quite a bit of research on this. And basically, museums, or the public does trust museums, much more than media, much more than government. And it's largely because we have facts that are evidenced, we have authentic objects, and we have experts that tell our stories. So that level of trust is actually very important. There's also more recent research which has come out largely during and post-COVID, which suggests that in fact the public wants us to deal with socially relevant issues, but how we do it, that's still an open question. And so it's very important to continue that dialogue to make sure that we get it right. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Can you thank the panel?